I'll speak first. I'm the president of AAUP Penn. Be followed by Huda Fakhreddin and Sukena Hirji, who are Penn faculty members and members of Faculty for Justice in Palestine. They'll be speaking for FJP. After that will be Ed Brockenbrough, who's associate professor at the Graduate School of Education, followed by Sarah Jackson, presidential associate professor at the Annenberg School for Communication and an AAUP Penn member. Amy Hillier will speak next. She is an associate professor at the School of Social Policy and Practice and an AAUP Penn member. Karen Redrobe will speak next. She is a full professor in the School of Arts and Sciences and a member of both AAUP Penn and Faculty for Justice in Palestine. Without further ado, I'll begin. I'd like to read comments that were written by the AAUP Penn Executive Committee. This is a statement of the Executive Committee. We condemn in the strongest possible terms the decision of the Penn administration to call in riot police early this morning to arrest students and faculty engaged in nonviolent anti-war protest on our campus. It was a violation of the university's guidelines on open expression and a cowardly, shameful attempt to silence and punish speech that administrators simply do not want to hear. We further condemn the administration's abuse of the student disciplinary system in summoning numerous students to disciplinary meetings on specious grounds. And we condemn the decision of Penn's provost, John Jackson, to impose mandatory leaves of absence on 6 students involved in the encampment on May 9th. Provost Jackson abused the student disciplinary system, using it not to punish violations of university rules. There are none here that we know of, but simply to silence criticism of Israeli government policies and of the war in Gaza. Bowing to pressure from donors, politicians, and lobbying organizations that would like to control what can be taught and studied in the United States, and which have consistently misrepresented the character of a peaceful anti-war encampment, Penn's administration has violated a core principle of academic freedom, the right of students to freedom in learning, which includes their right to assemble and engage in political activity. We demand that all charges be dropped, that the university reverse the mandatory leaves and other sanctions imposed on students, that the university dismiss all disciplinary cases against students targeted for their participation in the encampment, and that the university cease its pattern of threatening students with discipline and arrest for nonviolent anti-war protest. Those of us who have spent time on College Green in recent weeks know that the encampment was an example of nonviolent protest. It complied with Penn's guidelines on open expression, and it embodied a form of protest that is utterly familiar and ordinary on college campuses. Students slept in tents, hung banners, hosted talks and teach-ins, created art, read, studied, and chanted. Heeding the advice of groundskeepers, student protesters even periodically repositioned their tents so as not to harm the grass. Classes, exams, meetings, research, and education on our campus have proceeded. In fact, with support from faculty and staff, the encampment hosted educational events that were in desperately short supply this year as donor pressure and administrative repression undermined the ability of faculty, staff, and students to organize events on the history, culture, and politics of Israel and Palestine. While the university administration repeatedly mischaracterized the encampment as a threat to safety, the only threats of violence that occurred here were threats against the students in the encampment, including one from a man with a hunting knife and the other from a man who sprayed tents and food with a chemical agent. It was not the encampment, but the university administration that created a crisis. Mimicking the response of university administrations across the country, administrators spent weeks whipping up fear by misrepresenting peaceful protest as a threat to safety, threatening students with discipline, and accusing them of violating unnamed rules without any evidence, all in an apparent attempt to legitimate a crackdown or intimidate protesters into leaving. When protesters stayed, as was their right, the administration turned to flagrant violations of due process, summarily imposing mandatory leaves of absence on 6 students on May 9th, silencing them by removing them from campus. These acts of escalation were in no one's interest. They have imperiled the futures of students who were exercising their rights to assemble and to engage in political activity. rights protected by the principle of academic freedom and by the university's own policies. They were forms of incitement and acts of intimidation. They were intolerable responses to a nonviolent student demonstration. This is not the kind of university our students deserve. The administration's acts of escalation were also violations of the university's own policies. Penn's guidelines on open expression are framed to protect the right to protest, specifically in situations like this one, where there is disagreement. For that very reason, in case of conflict between university policies, the guidelines on open expression explicitly take precedence over all other policies. The guidelines prohibit the university from restricting assembly or demonstration on the basis of the substance or nature of the views expressed. Yet that is exactly what the administration has done for months. Since last fall, the university administration has established a pattern of silencing, threatening, and punishing speech critical of the war in Gaza and of Israeli government policies. In futile attempts to appease donors, lobbying organizations, and politicians who neither understand nor respect the principles of academic freedom and open expression, the administration has restricted a Jewish student group's ability to screen a film critical of the state of Israel. It has banned the student group Penn Against the Occupation. It has failed to show adequate concern for the harassment of Palestinian, Muslim, Iranian, and Arab students and faculty. It has issued public statements that have contributed to that harassment. And it has repeatedly abused the student disciplinary system to punish nonviolent anti-war activity. This pattern of discrimination in every instance targeting speech critical of the war in Gaza is itself a violation of Penn's guidelines on open expression. And it raises very serious questions about Penn's adherence to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Compounding this violation of the guidelines on open expression, the provost appears to have abused his power and violated due process protections in imposing mandatory leaves on students. Under Part 3D of the Charter of the Student Disciplinary System, the provost may only impose such leaves when a student's presence on campus threatens, quote, order, health, safety, or the conduct of the university's educational mission, end quote. These students' presence represented no such threat. It is indicative of the Orwellian nature of university governance, however, that the university administration holds the exclusive power to make this determination, which allowed the provost to characterize the protest as threatening by fiat. Meanwhile, the provost appears to have violated another part of the charter. Part 3D requires the provost to consult the student's dean or associate dean before imposing a mandatory leave. As far as we know, the provost flouted that requirement. In the immediate term, we reiterate that all charges must be dropped, and the administration must reverse the mandatory leaves and the other sanctions imposed on students. It must end its abuse of the student disciplinary system to silence and punish anti-war protest, first by withdrawing all cases against students that are currently being processed by the Center for Community Standards and Accountability. In the longer term, our university needs an entirely new system for enforcing its guidelines on open expression, the university policy that defines and defends the right to participate in demonstrations. Currently, the Vice Provost for University Life, an arm of the central administration, has the exclusive power to interpret and enforce the guidelines. And as a result, the university administration has repeatedly violated the guidelines in its treatment of student protest with no consequences whatsoever. The power to interpret and enforce the guidelines on open expression must be taken away from the central administration and transferred to a new elected body consisting of faculty, both tenure track and non-tenure track, staff, and students, all elected at large. This should be the beginning of a thorough redesign of university governance to provide faculty of all ranks, staff, grad workers, and students with real democratic power to write and enforce university policies. Only then will we be able to defend our rights to academic freedom and open expression, including the right of students to assemble and engage in nonviolent protest. Across the country, university administrations have called in armed police to clear encampments by force, but they have failed to silence peaceful protest against the war in Gaza. We stand with our students and colleagues who have displayed moral courage and discipline in the face of threats and police aggression. Peaceful protest is a necessary part of education and of democracy itself. We stand with all those working to defend the university as a democratic institution and a space of free and critical research, teaching, learning, and expression. With that, I want to turn it over to my colleagues Huda Fakhruddin and Sukaina Hirji, who are Penn faculty members and members of Faculty for Justice in Palestine, and they'll be speaking for FJP.
Thank you, Amy. My name is Huda Fakhruddin. I teach Arabic literature here at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm speaking on behalf of FJP, Faculty for Justice in Palestine. Our students' encampment in solidarity with Gaza was an opportunity for the University of Pennsylvania to do better, an opportunity for this university to redeem itself from its shameful behavior, from its capitulation and caving under the pressure of donors and outside lobbyists since its attack on the Palestine Rights Literature Festival in September. And since then, this university has been violating its own policies on open expression and free speech in order to silence Palestinian, pro-Palestinian voices and anti-genocide voices. This day will go on the record as the day in which the University of Pennsylvania called the police to harass and arrest its Palestinian and Jewish students and their allies and the faculty who were there to protect them. Students and faculty who say no to genocide, who stand in defense of our academic freedoms and our right to learn and teach. This is day 216 of a genocide against the Palestinian people. 216 days of scholasticide. All the universities and schools in Gaza have been leveled to the ground. More than 35,000 people murdered, including more than 14,000 children, and thousands still under the rubble. We stand steadfast in defense and support of our students and their clear, just, and reasonable demands. Disclose unethical investments. We do not need bloodshed and murder to fund our education. Divest from the murder of children. Divest from genocide. Divest from the apartheid terrorist state. Defend your students, your brave students who are speaking truth to power and are standing up in defense of this institution's academic integrity and in defense of its mission as a university. Thank you.
All right, I'm also going to make a brief statement. So I first want to just make an announcement also on behalf of FJP that there will be a rally at 3 p.m. at the Love Statue, and everybody is welcome, including press. So I also wanted to say a little bit on behalf of FJP. So just to kind of reiterate, we really support the AAUP's statement that it's important to defend the students' right to protest and right to open expression. But we also, as FJP, want to emphasize how important it is to place this particular movement in its context. So I think we should all be thinking about how history is going to remember this moment and Penn's place in that history. And just to sort of be clear about the context, our students are involved in one of the biggest campus anti-war movements in history. They're protesting what many experts have called a genocide, and I think what is undeniably at this point, clearly a catastrophic human rights violation. So when we're thinking about how to weigh what the students are doing against the discomfort or inconvenience felt by some around the encampment, I think we really need to keep in mind the importance of what they're fighting for. We should also remember from the long tradition of campus protests that the students have learned about in their classrooms, including in my own classroom and including the teach-ins that I've done at the encampment, that the point of protests is to challenge norms and standards of justice, and that often involves moments of civil disobedience. So it is inherently reactionary to expect that protests are never disruptive or uncomfortable in any way, and that they don't make any kinds of meaningful demands. And it's especially reactionary in a context where many have felt that the status quo on campus has been extremely repressive up until this moment. Over the last 2 weeks, the students have tried to create a space for conversation around Gaza that up until this point has been almost impossible to have openly on Penn's campus. So I myself, I'm not a shy professor, but I have not felt comfortable saying the word Gaza or Palestine in my classrooms for fear of being doxxed or ending up in a lawsuit or in a congressional hearing. And today, seeing hundreds of cops in riot gear arrest students and faculty sends to me and to my students and to all of us, I think, a very clear message about what conversations are and are not allowed on Penn's campus going forward. The point of a university is to make space for conversations that challenge the status quo, and I think we've all collectively failed in that mission today.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Ed Brockenbrough, who is an associate professor at the Graduate School of Education.
Good afternoon, folks. Ed Brockenbrough. As Amy said, I'm an associate professor at the Graduate School of Education, where I basically teach teachers how to teach. After seeing a series of emails from universities, the university's leaderships characterizing the encampments as this really violent, disruptive space, I decided to see the encampment for myself this past Wednesday. Gathered under a large tent when I arrived was a group of about 10 to 15 people participating in a teach-in on the history of the occupation of Palestine. And I knew that that was what was going on because there was a whiteboard with a whole itinerary for the day listed. So when I arrived, they were participating in the teach-in. Next up was a workshop on anti-doxing, and then following that were some more sessions on topics related to the issues that the encampment was exploring. Characterizations in official university communications of the student encampment as a violent disruption of university life depend on invisibilizing the intentionally, innately, and beautifully pedagogical nature of the space. Contrary to narratives that these students don't know what they're talking about and they're just looking for something to do, or contrary to misrepresentations of these students' collective actions as in conflict with the mission of Penn, this was an educational space, one in which students played a lead role in creating curriculum and operating as peer teachers and learners. It's also what we could consider an educational counter space, a counter space that was countering the silence that was mentioned earlier around the issues that students were interested in learning more about. The divides that surfaced across numerous campuses starting last October underscored the complex politics and emotions surrounding the Israel-Palestine conflict. These divides also highlight the urgent need for educational institutions to create opportunities to learn about the history and politics behind this conflict, to explore various strategies to resolve it, and to help students and other university community members develop the tools to discuss all of this across political, national, ideological, and religious differences. Democracies desperately need educational spaces that surface the issues that divide us and that equip us with the knowledge and skills to live and work across our differences. In the future, I hope that Penn's administration and leaders of other universities think of more productively pedagogical responses to spaces like student encampments. Invited speakers with expertise in multiple perspectives around this issue. Mediated town hall meetings with clearly established norms of engagement, and conversations in smaller, more intimate spaces like classrooms, dorms, and other spaces where students might feel more comfortable are much more productively pedagogical responses that university leaderships can take to issues like the student encampment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker will be Sarah Jackson, who's Presidential Associate Professor at the Annenberg School for Communication and an AAUP Penn member.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody who's taking the time to join us. I just want to say a few words as an expert on media and communication and social movements and activism about some of the communication that we've received about the encampment and some of the other issues of concern to me and I believe many of the folks on the call today. Much of the administration's messaging about the encampment that we've received over the past several weeks, essentially since it began, has discounted the lived experiences of faculty, students, and staff who live and work on campus every day, and, as my colleagues have noted, have experienced the encampment not as a violent or threatening space, but as a lively space for education, debate, community, and politics. In that way, our encampment was very much like countless other encampments, sit-ins, and other forms of disobedience that has existed on college campuses for all time. Yet the messaging from the administration and also non-campus entities has veered dangerously towards propaganda and become a source of escalation and fear for many. The messaging itself has created fear among many. The messaging implicitly legitimized harassment against student activists and legitimized reactionary responses to anybody speaking about the issues in question at the encampment. And as we saw this morning, ultimately, the role of that messaging was to serve as cover to legitimize calling the police onto campus and other draconian measures against nonviolent students. I must reiterate that bringing police onto campus terrifies many students and many other members of the campus community whose safety and fears have been largely ignored amid everything that has been going on. And it is shocking that just 4 years after a global uprising against police brutality, the administration would risk our safety in this way. There was another way, and other campuses who have treated their encampment members as community members and not as criminals have not been in the press, and you have not read about them as much in the news because that other way is, of course, less publicly visible and newsworthy. Yet here we are. So finally, I'd like to just add that Penn has a world-class faculty. Among us are experts on anti-Semitism, experts on right-wing media, experts on congressional politics, experts on Mideast history, experts on anti-war activism, experts on political speech in the First Amendment, experts on education, and experts on the very definition of genocide. The students in the encampment have invited many of us, many faculty members, to come speak with them about our expertise because they are genuinely and we're genuinely trying to learn. These young people have learned not only from us at the university level, but since grade school about peace activism, from activism against the development of the atom bomb to activism against the invasion of Iraq after 9/11. And it is a deep violation of educational principles to now penalize students for taking these ideas that they have learned and independently applying them to their own lives. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Amy Hillier, who's an associate professor at the School of Social Policy and Practice and an AUP Penn member.
Thank you. I'm speaking as a social worker, as a faculty member, as a Penn alum, and as a resident of West Philadelphia. The university administration has consistently mischaracterized the nature of the encampment, as my colleagues have also shared. Like many other faculty, I visited the encampment regularly over the past 2 weeks. I engaged in beautiful conversations with students I know and with people I was meeting for the first time. I was deeply moved upon reading the encampment guidelines for members on display on the large dry erase board, holding each other to a high ethical standard. The ethic of care present certainly exceeded what transpires in classrooms and faculty meetings. What I saw was not disruptive to the operations of the university. The only time I worried for my safety and the safety of others was when 2 counter-protesters arrived and started shouting at people in the encampment that they were terrorists and would never get a job, and writing in sidewalk chalk right in front of me and at least one small child, "Fuck Palestine." Like many other people, I am reeling from the images of police and riot gear surrounding College Hall and arresting our students this morning. Those images stand in stark contrast to what I witnessed at the encampment on Wednesday. Love, learning, courage, and an invitation to imagine a more just world.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Karen Redrobe, who's a full professor in the School of Arts and Sciences and a member of both AAUP Penn and Faculty for Justice in Palestine.
Hello, everybody. I'm a feminist scholar whose work focuses on media and violence. I'm the mom of a Penn alum, and I have dedicated 20 years of my life now to Penn's academic, creative, and community-based mission. One of the inherited obligations that we members of the University of Pennsylvania share as we live in the terrible wakes of European colonialism and the Second World War is the obligation to protect academic freedom and the free exchange of ideas in higher education as a key pillar of a democratic society. I'm sorry, I'm upset from having been in the middle of the police this morning. In the 1930s, fascist governments undermined democracy in part by targeting the free and critical speech and creative expression of artists and scholars who sounded alarm about what they witnessed taking place, a silencing that took many forms, including repression, coercion, firing, and in many cases, ultimately death. Our democracy requires universities to make space for the open expression and contestation of ideas as part of collective and research-based quests in the service of truth and the public good. Since before the Palestine Rights Festival in September 2023, powerful external as well as internal forces have attempted to suppress the presence of Palestinian poetry, music, history, and existence from our campus. And I attended that festival and can witness that it was a beautiful, moving, joyous, and challenging event. They have also attempted to challenge these forces, the university's already inadequate diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Donors and counter-protesters have used financial threat, doxing, including death threats, lawsuits, political ties, and despicable misuses of the very real phenomenon of anti-Semitism to pressure university leaders to abdicate their responsibilities to protect the conditions under which learning happens, as well as to protect all the members of its own community. I bear witness here to the way policies and protections have been bypassed, classrooms for learning about unwanted histories and cultures have been withheld, and violent threats and actions against pro-Palestinian faculty, staff, and students have been simply ignored. That many of the victims of counter-protesters' aggression and neglect have been female, non-binary, minority, and queer students, staff, and faculty members is an important factor of this landscape, and the same is true of student disciplinary cases and today's arrests. As a teacher by vocation, I have no choice but to refuse and resist efforts to dismantle the integrity of our classrooms and of research-based knowledge and genuine inquiry. My conscience obliges me to bear witness to the peaceful, generous, brave, and intellectually engaged protests I have observed at the encampment, where I have spent a great deal of time to assess for myself the state of things. I offer my support to students, staff, and faculty colleagues who express their right to protest peacefully against the mass death being inflicted on the people at Gaza of this time, and to express and explore their moral and historical questions with all the protections guaranteed by Penn's open expression policies, as well as to expect mutual accountability and democratic freedoms on our campus. Thank you.